Now what we've seen is a really deep narrative war, a propaganda war to tell us that Ukraine is actually not only going to be fine, but that Ukraine is winning the war, that Ukraine is somehow going to defeat Russia and it's going to keep going. And you have Zelensky, even though he acknowledged it's very difficult in Soledar and that the situation was difficult, he has not acknowledged the defeat. And this is despite the fact that a lot of Ukraine's top, defense minister, etc., were warning about this. We're talking about how many troops, how many soldiers were being killed, and that the situation was very dire. But nonetheless, we've had a big narrative war around Soledar. And so I want to play what the Duran had to say about the narrative, because I think it's very important. I think this is what's most important to me, because I think, when it comes to military expertise, that's not what I have. It's obviously a major loss for Ukraine anytime that Russia can make advances when its strategy right now is just the meat grinder. It's just a war of attrition. It's just a matter of slowly grinding down Ukraine's military. A major victory within that context means that things aren't going so well for Ukraine, and it's likely a sign of things to come. It's not to say that we're not going to see any any more offenses from Ukraine, or that Ukraine isn't going to try to throw more people at the front lines to try to wage an offensive at some point during this conflict. But what it means is that, well, the line has been holding pretty steady. The line that has been drawn, the line of conflict that's been drawn, has been holding pretty steady. There's really been no gains anywhere other than Russia making pretty big gains in grinding down Ukraine's military and its infrastructure. That's what's been happening. And now Soledar has fallen to Russia, and it has caused a bit of a panic, and it's created what is a narrative, the need for narrative management. So let me play for you what the Duran had to say about that, about how they're going to spin this situation, because I think it's very interesting, and I happen to agree very much so with what they're saying. So let's play it.
Well, the entire narrative of the collective West, whether it's been NATO officials, the Biden White House, the EU officials, the media, Zelensky, the entire narrative is built on the premise that NATO and Ukraine are going to push Russia out of Ukrainian lands, including Crimea. I mean, that's been the entire framing of this of how the collective West and Ukraine are going to take on Russia. That is the goal. The goal is Russia pre-1991, Ukraine pre-1991 borders.
Yeah.
And they go on about that. And they've gone on
Yes.
about that,
Yes.
article after article, speech after speech, statement after statement. So when you see the territory in reverse being taken by the Russians, and you couple that with horrendous, terrible, catastrophic loss in personnel and equipment, then people are going to start to say, wait a minute, we've been told one thing and we're seeing everything, all the metrics moving in a completely opposite direction. And then you can also make the economic argument as well. Russia's economy is going to be in tatters. They see everything moving in a different direction than what they've been led to believe. And that's a problem. While Russia, they have said, Surovikin has specifically said, my goal as commander at this point is to grind down the Ukraine military. I mean, he said that. So it's going to be slow. It's going to be a war of attrition. But my goal is to grind down the Ukraine military, demilitarization. Yes, there's territory involved. Yes, Russia has incorporated 4 new regions, but it's always been about fighting the Ukraine military beyond and above anything else. And when Russia needs to retreat from territory in order to preserve personnel and equipment, they do that without any hesitation. They take the media hits.
So what Alex is really describing there is the fantasy that's been created by Ukraine, that's been created by the Western corporate media, that's been created by the collective West, the United States in the lead, about Ukraine, that Ukraine is doing incredibly on the battlefield, that Russia's doing so poorly both on the battlefield, its economy is in tatters. You've had this mythical narrative being so powerful in terms of its reach and its scope that this battle, this loss of Soledar that Ukraine just experienced is really kind of this wake up call that won't really be heeded. And you already see it not be heeded, of course, by the Western political establishment because that would go against its interests. But it'll be very interesting to see how this affects overall public opinion because not only is this happening, this loss of Soledar, but it spells kind of the future of where this conflict is going. But let's continue because Alexander, I think, makes really good points about how this will all be spun.
That is exactly right. I mean, the Russians have a much simpler sort of task explaining what's going on to their public and in their media because, well, I mean, they've been fairly consistent in what they've been saying for many months now. Not always, but for very, many months now. Whereas the West has been consistently promoting this story about Ukraine resisting, Ukraine winning, Ukraine recovering all its lost lands, that sort of thing. I will say that every so often, you do see some people in the West come forward and say that the objective is to push Russia back to the 24th February lines, which of course would mean Crimea is still under Russian control, and it would still mean the Donbass regions, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, as they were constituted before the start of the most recent fighting, being pushed back to that point. I don't think that, though, is anywhere close to being the dominant narrative. The dominant narrative is very much the one you said. Well, they are going to get into this trap, but it's a trap of their own making. I don't know how they get out of it. I mean, I suspect the way they get out of it is one you've touched on in the past, which is that they relegate the story. They start moving on to some other story, Taiwan, maybe, Iran, something else. But they don't talk as much about Ukraine, and
Well, what's really interesting about that point is that you've had a flurry of stories. You've had the Financial Times interview the top US General James Balmier in Japan, saying that the US is laying the groundwork, setting the theater, he says, which is military speak, for a war with China over Taiwan through its overall militarization of the Asia Pacific. You also have the Center for Strategic in International Studies, this U.S. State Department funded think tank. This think tank is also funded by major military contractors, major allied governments, including the so-called government of Taiwan. This think tank also came out with a war simulation over Taiwan. So you've already had, and this is all just in the last week. So you've already had a major shift in the attention, right? It's not just Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. The United States' corporate media, the Western corporate media loves to talk about Ukraine when they can frame it as things are going well. But now this is a moment where you cannot spin it. You cannot say, oh, well, Ukraine actually won in Soledar. No. And you can't say, well, things are going to be good from here on out after Soledar, because it actually is a pretty big deal. And because Bakhmut is also likely going to go the same way at some point. We can't predict when, but at some point, it'll probably go the same direction with a Russian victory. So the writing's on the wall, and I think that's exactly right, that there has already been a lot of suppression, a lot of just redirecting people's eyes to the next war.
Try to sort of play down the significance of what's happening in Ukraine. That's one possibility. The other possibility, which we can never discount, is that they double and triple down. So they've sent Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. They've sent Marder infantry fighting vehicles. They've sent Paladin self-propelled guns. This is the latest weapons delivery. They've sent Patriots. Now they're going to send Aster air defense missiles. Not going to make any significant difference. They're not that many of them, then don't provide much of a new capability. They're going to send heavy battle tanks, Leopard 2s, Challenger 2s from Britain, perhaps Leclercs from France, perhaps even Abrams that they're from the US, that they're ruling that out from the moment. And of course, ultimately, always the danger that they might try and persuade some of the East European states of NATO, like Poland, to become directly involved in the fighting. And of course, Poland is now talking about setting up a new division on the eastern borders, equipped exclusively with Western equipment, Abrams tanks, Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, and perhaps, just possibly, that's earmarked for some kind of intervention in Ukraine. So I think it's going to be one or the other, it seems to me. They're either going to try to forget the whole story, pretend this all didn't happen, or, relegate it to a sort of minor affair, or in the alternative, they double, triple down in exactly the way I've just said, and which we've discussed on previous programs. But it's going to be one or the other. I mean, they can't, accept that this has been a defeat, a straightforward defeat, because far too many political reputations now hang on this, and far more journalistic reputations hang on this as well, by the way.
So, that's all I'll play from the clip, but I do want to, I think it's the second point is interesting as well, because that's just how the pattern of this conflict has gone anyway. So it would be kind of remiss to think, oh yeah, well, the United States and the collective West, they're going to take this defeat and say, we'll do the rational thing, which is figure out how to develop an off-ramp. Absolutely not. The United States and NATO, they're going to try to figure out another way to get what they want, another way to prolong this. And that will be through weapons, of course. But, there's a big problem with that. We've talked about it here. NATO weapons stockpiles are depleted. Production, transferring of these weapons is not going to be easy. It's going to take time. And that's why the U.S. is going to have to rely on NATO allies like Poland to do some of this dirty work with the weapons that it provided Poland over the course of the years when it was militarizing and doing military exercises and preparing the way for this kind of thing. That's what NATO encirclement has always been about. So, I think that's exactly right. That it's going to be more weapons and it's going to be more propaganda, and there's propaganda by omission as well. And so those are two of the big ways. I don't think it's one or the other, though. I think that both can be done, because I think that when you lay the groundwork of getting people's eyes away from the reality of the situation, like they're doing in Soledar, then you can start building up the conditions for prolonging the war, because you will have people, not so much the general public in the West, those forces who might be sparked into wanting more, wanting peace, wanting an end to this thing. I mean, people are already pretty sick of this, but to keep people from going the next step in that process, divert their attention to the next thing, right? Divert their attention to Taiwan. I'm writing an article on the Foreign Policy magazine, had this massive article on these 12 areas to prepare for the next war. That's how they framed it. And the next war, of course, is with China over Taiwan. But they try to dance around it, but it's very direct. And you have people like David Petraeus, war criminal, someone who literally presided over, when he was the top commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan and occupied Afghanistan, presided over the missile strikes and drone strikes of weddings, public events, civilian areas. War criminal David Petraeus is part of this. You have all of these major think tanks like the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the Alliance of Democracies, the International Institute for Strategic Studies. All of these are basically institutions that are aligned or completely wholly owned subsidiaries of the military industrial complex. And so, you have these forces and also two former NATO secretary generals, one being under Obama, one being under Trump, but both of them being kind of Obama attached, aligned forces, all of them arguing what's needed is more weapons, more sanctions, more advanced production lines, the ability to make weapons faster, scrap the old Cold War production system, make sure that you're fighting the propaganda war and that you're controlling what people think and what people know about war, because big bad China, big bad Russia are trying to divert your eyes in a manner to make them think that the U.S. and the collective West are the problem. Cyber technology, all of these areas, all with one purpose: to tell you should go. You should be okay with the future war over Taiwan with China. And so they're already looking at this because I think they know that the writing is on the wall, that Ukraine is not going so well right now. Soledar is just one instance. But what's so interesting about how the development of this conflict has transpired and what's happened is that even now, where you have Bakhmut probably going to fall to Russia, now you had Soledar, a victory for Russia in Soledar, and you've also had just a stagnant conflict situation for a while that's only been really characterized by Russia making pretty hard offensive strikes on Ukraine's military infrastructure and its overall infrastructure, weakening its capacity to fight this war at all, grinding down Ukraine's military. You still have the Western corporate media saying, we won, we're winning, look how weak Russia is. And that was the case in this article as well. So Alex and Alexander are right. There are these very few options for the US and NATO to take to spin what's going on in this conflict, to spin the actual reality on the ground, which is that Ukraine really doesn't stand a chance. It never did. Ukraine never stood a chance here. How could it? Ukraine was always a very poor country since its inception. Ukraine went through a massive coup. Ukraine didn't stand a chance in this moment to defeat Russia, but that never really was the point, right? The point has always been encircle Russia with NATO, use Ukraine as the primary proxy to weaken Russia, and hope that the overall strength of each part of this proxy war, the sanctions, the military conflict, the propaganda war, all of it would lead to Russia's downfall. But that hasn't happened. And Soledar has them just going kind of mad, right? They're losing, they're declining in terms of their logic, their rationality, their stability. They're really having a tough time with this, and as they should. I've been thinking about this a lot because I think it points the way to what is going to happen now globally in 2023. We're going to see, I think, the United States, like the honeymoon, in my opinion, is over. The Biden administration didn't even try. There are times when presidential administrations try to establish some kind of mechanism for normalization. And all we got was a little bit of forward movement with Venezuela because the United States is desperate for that energy and that oil. But really not much because sanctions on Venezuela still continue, even if they aren't as strong. But we didn't get any progress with the DPRK, as we showed earlier on the program. We haven't gotten any with Russia. Things have only gotten worse. With China, things haven't really gotten better, no matter how many breaths are taken, deep breaths are taken, where things kind of pause a bit, you still see massive escalations there, not least the last week of just utter chatter, this loud cacophony for preparations with war with China. You see these massive escalations with China happening under Biden to a degree where we could very well say we've only seen a build-up from the Trump administration. We haven't seen any rollback of anything in that regard. Iran? What have we seen with Iran? We've just seen the disintegration of the JPCOA agreement. It hasn't come back. Biden promised it would come back. It hasn't come back. Sanctions on Iran are still going strong. And of course, the United States' presence in the Middle East after that botched withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021 has also been the same. It's been a pariah. It's been all about occupation. And now it's all about trying to divide that region from China and from Russia, trying to strong arm Saudi Arabia. Things haven't gotten better, right? Things have not gotten better in that area as well. So the United States at this point under Biden has not even had any sort of attempt, right? As we enter the latter half of its first term of its administration, who knows if there will be a second term, but we haven't seen any kind of attempt to build a legacy. Even Obama, during the pivot to Asia, during the encirclement campaign against Russia, in the first term, tried to play diplomacy with both countries. Of course, that all went absolutely down down the trash chute when the United States facilitated the coup in Ukraine in 2014, and of course, really ramped up the encirclement campaign with China, and of course, the information war as well. But even Obama during the early period was trying to play diplomacy. It was in this area with certain aspects. And then, of course, you had the JPCOA, which was kind of Obama's so-called baby. I wouldn't say that Obama should be credited for that because there were a lot of huge flaws and things that were not in Iran's interests. And it was very heavily weighted toward the U.S. and the Western powers. But at the same time, Obama could claim that. Biden is, to me, an even worse kind of Obama, because while Obama had more fertile ground to be a more effective evil, the United States was in a much better position economically, politically. Well, I shouldn't say economically because it was coming off the heels of the 2007-2008 crisis, but it's still, even after that crisis, was a bigger economy. And then it also still had a lot more weight internationally because China and Russia, think about this, guys. China and Russia were weaker, so much weaker just 12 years ago, 13 years ago, right? So things have changed so rapidly. In the Biden administration, all it can do is escalate, escalate, escalate. And that's what's going to happen after Soledar, because they're desperate to keep things the way they are, to keep this permanency of war in Ukraine, because it is a boon for profits for the stocks of these major military contractors, these big monopolies that have monopolized the weapons industry. It's a boon for Wall Street. And of course, it's a boon for the US's political legitimacy and its ability to corner Europe and to continue its pursuit of fully privatizing and ultimately making Europe politically subservient as well. So privatizing its economy and making it politically subservient to the United States in totality without any interruption. And that's why we see the Biden administration continue to pursue what it's doing in Ukraine. And Soledar is not going to be any kind of lesson for the United States. What it's going to be is another reason why the United States has to give more, has to support more. But there are limits to all of this. And at this point, unlike under Obama, there are far more limits to what the United States' empire, what its military apparatus, what its entire system can do in this situation when faced against a country like Russia, which, has the capacity to both defend itself and wage offensive operations. We're talking about Russia, which still has 100,000 plus troops ready to go to continue the meat grinder and also possibly score more victories like this and create even more fertile terrain for the United States to feel the pressure, for NATO to feel the pressure of a changing course in this conflict. I don't think it will, but at some point, things are going to have to shift in some manner, whether it's the United States and NATO doing the unthinkable, escalating to the point where there is a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia, more direct than now. Russia saying it's fighting NATO, but this could turn hot, or whether it's forced to come to some kind of ceasefire agreement, which we know it wouldn't follow anyway.